This is The Future of, where experts share their vision of the future and how their work is helping shape it for the better.
I'm David Blaney. Thanks to technology, we can now access all kinds of music all the time and carefully curate not just our playlists, but our very identities. How is this instant availability changing the way we consume music? And how can this technology change still to make music more immediate? To discuss the future of this topic further, with me today is Dr Adrian North, who heads the School of Psychology at Curtin University and researches the social and applied psychology of music. Thank you very much for coming in today, Adrian.
You're welcome.
Spotify, Tidal, Apple Music, Amazon Music, YouTube, etc., 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 digital radio, streaming, live shows. Have we reached a zenith of music availability? Have we peaked?
I don't know if we've peaked. I mean, there's very little scope for it to go much further, simply because at the moment I think it's approximately 50 million tracks available online. So, I mean, and obviously that will continue to grow over time. I think the crucial thing is I don't see it disappearing anytime soon. And it's a very exciting time to be involved in music research, because particularly our relationship with music has completely changed as a consequence of this technological innovation. So if you think, historically, we used to be in a position whereby music was arranged by a hierarchy. You had a composer who would pass the music to an orchestra who would play it to the audience, or you had a culture which would pass the music to, say, a street musician who in turn would play it to an audience. That's completely changed with particularly streaming services, whereas now we have access to 40, 50, 60 million pieces of music on demand almost anywhere in the world, or anywhere with a decent phone signal at least. And so as a consequence, what we're starting to see is people using music. And so as people use music more and more in their daily life to achieve particular goals, that of course creates a market for people to start pumping music into that massive audience base that's now building.
And it's become almost like the sort of unofficial soundtrack to your life. I can listen to a song while I'm well, not at the gym, but well, look at me. No, while I'm out running or while I'm commuting, I can pick songs which match what I'm doing.
Absolutely. I did some research quite a long time ago now, at the very, very beginning of the streaming era. And what we did there was we just pinged people a text message to their phone, at almost literally random times throughout the day, or from 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. And just, one of the questions on it was, can you hear music? And I think it was, from memory, I think it was 34% of the time that we pinged people at random, they could hear music. Mm-hmm. So in other words, a third of your life seems to have some sort of musical accompaniment, which is an astonishing figure.
Does this instant gratification of being able to pick and choose what we want to listen to, rather than having it, having someone at Radio 1 or whatever tell us what to listen to, does this have psychological benefits for us?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, crucially, what it does, it gives much greater opportunity for people to explore and to test themselves. So, I mean, so I'm in my late 40s now, and I remember when I was a kid, if I was born in the UK, if I got £5 for Christmas, I'd run to the shop and buy an album, which was a huge investment. Whereas these days, if you've got a streaming service, what that means is essentially you can try something out, and if it's not for you, just press skip, move on. It hasn't effectively cost you anything. There's no marginal cost of trying something out. So although I'm not aware of any hard evidence on it at the moment, certainly this current business model that the industry is using really does incentivize people to try to discover music. Now it's got very much a downside too, because of course, if you've got access to somewhere between 40 and 60 million tracks, then you've got the challenge of, well, what do I listen to? Again, going back to my childhood days, if you've only got 10 or 20 albums in your collection, it's pretty easy to decide what you're going to pick from. It's not a difficult choice. Whereas if you've suddenly got to pick from between 40 or 60 million tracks, it's actually very difficult to find something amongst all that. And so the next challenge that this industry faces is all around the recommendation algorithm. That's turning into a huge issue for them, because if people can't find music they want, then they say, why should I keep paying for access to all these tracks when I'm not listening to them?
And of course, the algorithm has become it's the selector of what we listen to. Do you think we're losing the sort of tastemakers that we had on radio, for example?
I don't think we necessarily are. I mean, there's a strong argument if you look at the more kind of business studies literature on this, which talks about how when you get these kind of markets where it is very difficult to find the particular thing, the particular instance that you want to purchase or you want to consume, you actually have to increasingly rely on tastemakers. I think the other side of that as well is I think that the streaming industry itself is clearly wise to this. So, across all the services, you're seeing this increasing reliance on items on your home screen about, what your friends are listening to, what the tastemakers are listening to, and so on. And I think, they're becoming increasingly attuned to this as well and trying to tap into that model as well. I mean, again, it's not a coincidence, I'm sure, that within the really big streaming services, they actually set up effectively radio stations within them that precisely do try to model that older
like
way
Beats
of
One on Apple Music.
exactly, yeah, and quite plainly, they're trying to hark back to the 1950s, 60s, 70s, where you would have the tastemaker DJ who would say, "Hey, everyone, listen to this." So for the market that wants that kind of approach, they're starting to cover that off, and then you've got the algorithm, ideally,
Like your daily mix on Spotify, for example.
Exactly, although. My personal criticism of that is when you look at the kind of stuff they recommend, it's still not terrifically well tailored. And this is really where my research starts.
In what sense?
Well, in that, of course, there's all kinds of variables that we know perfectly well that drive musical taste. And of course, to some extent, the streaming services tap into that. So, for example, Spotify does a very good job of trying to tap into location-based playlists and so on, like, for parties, exercising and so on. But there's also a whole range of other variables that influence musical taste that certainly can be built into those with relative ease, and which you don't really see that much use of at the moment, which, I suspect it's coming.
And you mentioned you were doing some research in this area.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we've been looking at how personality predicts musical taste, and it does. And again, that's a relatively simple thing that you can build into these kind of mechanisms. You can also infer personality from somebody's music listening. So conceptually, at least, it's possible for a streaming service to basically say, okay, if you'd like to give us access to your listening history, then what we can do is, on that basis, we can infer your personality. And on that basis, we can start to recommend all kinds of other types of music to you. Because one of the faults that they currently have for streaming services is that if you listen to artist A or composer A, then in your recommendation algorithm, what it will spit out to you next time is other music that also sounds like artist A or composer A. It doesn't allow for the fact that if you listen to, say, some jazz, 3 days later, you may want to listen to some classical music, or you may want to listen to some funk or to whatever else. And the current recommendation algorithms, because they're so focused on the musical properties, they don't allow for the fact that their musical tastes are much more broad-ranging than that. And that's where you need this psychological coverage, because that can explain why someone who listens to, say, jazz will also listen to classical music, will probably also listen to, say, ambient music as well. It speaks to openness to experience, one of the big 5 personality dimensions. So psychologists can tell you why people would listen to quite wide-ranging musical styles and which of those genres cluster together. But an analysis just based solely on musical properties alone can't really do that.
One of the big, commercial drivers of social media, for one, but also massive pitfalls, is that it can be a bit of an echo chamber. It learns what our preferences are, and we all the content that we're exposed to, and that mainly sort of dishes up more of the same, really.
Yeah.
Are we falling into a bit of a musical echo chamber where we're just being dished up with the same?
Yeah, I think there is that absolute real risk of that. And I think it's absolutely crucial that the streaming services in particular build in a much stronger understanding of what's motivating people's listening, because that then will explain why they want to listen to quite a diverse range of music. And of course, that's why, presumably, they're paying a monthly subscription often for a streaming service, because they want access to a range of music. So if instead you just keep pushing the same kind of stuff to them, why subscribe? Why not just buy outright at that relatively small range of music? And over the lifetime of a subscription, you'll save a fortune.
And not to mention once the subscription's gone, that's it. You don't have access to that music anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
One area of your research has also been not just what we're listening to and how we're listening to it, but also where you're listening to it. What impact does that have?
Yeah, it's quite interesting. I mean, so it looks like there's essentially 3 drivers of people's musical taste in very broad brush terms. There's the music itself, the properties of the music, and the variables there that we know are relatively important. There's obviously aspects of the listener, him or herself, most obviously, your age, your personality, and a bunch of other factors. But then in the mid-1990s, it started to become clear that there was this third class of variables, which were all around the listening situation. And in particular, that there seems to be kind of 2 processes going on there. Number one is that people are clearly using music to get what they want from the particular situation. They're using music, most obviously to create an atmosphere, but we go a lot more than that. We use music to concentrate, to achieve a particular mood and all kinds of other factors. But it works the other way around as well, in that the situation and the music that's playing in that situation directly impinges on us and our behaviour. So particularly in the late 1990s, myself and David Hargreaves, we did an awful lot of work looking at music in commercial environments, looking at how music can influence the products that people buy, even things like how quickly they shop, the products they choose to purchase, how long they keep waiting and how long they think they've been waiting for, and so on. And there's a whole cluster of variables there that up until that point in time just simply hadn't been recognised.
So I guess that's a little bit like how, for example, if I'm driving, I might be happy to listen to rock while I'm on a road trip, for example. But if I'm stuck in heavy traffic, I might want to listen to some classical music instead.
Yeah, absolutely. So we know that one of the peak hour in the day for people to listen to music is basically between 5 p.m. and 6 p.m., at least in the Western world, and that clearly coincides with people driving home. The other reason why we can be so confident of that is when we ask people about what we're using music for at different times of the day. Between 5 and 6 p.m, people will consistently tell you that they're using music to relax. So clearly that's a really big job that music does. Specifically, it calms us all down as we go home. But again, it works the other way around, to go with your point about driving. We know also that music influences the way that you drive. So we know that as the music gets louder or faster, it impinges on the amount of essentially psychological resource you have available to devote to driving. So we know that something I did many years ago now, we had people just doing a driving simulator on a computer. And when you play music that's loud and fast, people have, they just drive less well. Whereas when you play them exactly the same music, but slower, quieter version, they become much more efficient at driving. So it's this kind of two-way interaction, or it's a two-way street between the person and the situation. It's, the situation affects the person, and the person's, using music to affect the situation too.
How does music impact the way that we see ourselves, our identities? Not just what we're up to, but who we are.
Crucially, it does, is the first thing that's worth saying. But of course, it works on a number of different levels. There's a pretty well-established model within social psychology which talks about music having an influence on 4 levels of processes. And this is a little bit nerdy, but just bear with me, and it'll become more interesting in a minute, I hope. We know on the basis that on the kind of the basic level of this hierarchy of social influences are what gets called intra-individual factors solely inside you, like, say, your personality is one of them. The next level up, you have the so-called inter-individual level, which is when 2 people relate to one another on the basis of them being individuals. And we know that music plays a part there as well. So, for example, if I say I'm a fan of genre A, and you're also a fan of genre A, you will like me more as a direct consequence of that. And the flip side of that is true as well, unfortunately. If we don't like the same genres, then, for example, we know it plays a role in interpersonal attraction. Then at the next level up again, you get so-called interpersonal social influences, and in this case, in terms of music, we know that if I say I'm a fan of genre A, you would be more likely to assume I have the characteristics of other people who like genre A. So if you know someone who likes genre A who also happens to be really happy or really upbeat and optimistic, you're more likely to assume that I'm happy and optimistic and upbeat and so on. And then, of course, at the broadest level of the lot, you've got these broad cultural influences as well, which to do with, not just the music that a culture tends to, listen to more, but also in terms of the broader values that a culture has. And this is something I was literally writing about just yesterday, where you look at, there's one big model of culture produced by a guy called Geert Hofstede from the Netherlands. And he proposes that you can conceptualize culture in terms of 6 dimensions. And we know that the values that are embodied in those dimensions themselves relate to all kinds of different musical tastes as well. So right the way through, however you care to construct your identity, be it solely what I know about myself, what you know about me as a person, what you know about me as on the basis of my membership of a group, or even just what you know about me as my member of a broad culture. Music is part of that identity at each and every single level.
Do you think our ability to stream anything we want anytime, do you think there's a risk of that perhaps cheapening the craft?
There is always the risk that, well, I think yes and no.
It's a loaded question.
No, and I know what you're saying there. Any economist will tell you that if something is in effectively infinite supply for you, then it will lose its perceived value to you very quickly, and that's true. So if you think about the music that someone's listening to as they're driving into work in the morning, they may not particularly value that particular track that highly in that particular moment. But there's still this kind of broader level value of music, and I think there, you start with the advent of streaming. I think you start to see music become more valuable, and it's because music becoming presumably more present in people's everyday life. I think at that broader conceptual level, I think music actually becomes more valuable to people, not less valuable. But I think it's the individual piece of music in the moment that gets cheapened by it potentially.
So it's a bit of a mixed thing. Where do you see things trending in this space? What are some of the newest developments that we've seen in terms of music availability?
Yeah. The big thing which is coming is the streaming industry needing to come up with better recommendations. And clearly there is scope there for psychology to make a contribution to this, if only because at the moment there's relatively little psychological contribution to the streaming algorithms. It's very much based around the properties of the music, and that's because that's relatively easy for a computer to analyze. You can upload 40, 50, 60 million tracks into a computer, let it whir away for however long it needs to whir away for, and at the end of that, you've got a very nice picture of all the music in your database. But in order to come up with really good recommendations, you need to understand the person that's listening to it as well, and the situation in which they're listening to it, and what people want from that music. And it's only when you understand those two other pieces as well that you can then start to generate really smart recommendations. So, for example, tonight when you go home from the university, you will put on some music quite probably, and you will know exactly what you want that music to do. But it's because that music is tailored to you, to the kind of day you've had, and the kind of evening you've got coming up, and what you want to achieve. What state of mind you want to arrive in when you get home tonight. And simply knowing about the music alone won't achieve that.
There's a lot more to it.
Yeah, your algorithm needs to know about you rather than just about music. And it also needs to know what you're planning to do and where you are. And until the algorithms build in that, they're never going to be that great. They're going to be okay, but they're never going to be brilliant, and they're never going to nail it.
And the interesting thing as well is that it's a lot of this thought process will be happening in the background. I might not be actively thinking, well, I'm going to be going to a movie tonight, so I want to see this, this, and this, and this. It will be whirring away in the background.
You are right, although again, and this starts to then speak to issues around privacy and so on. But to be honest, your phone probably does know, because it knows what's in your diary. So to take your example, your phone probably does know if you're going to the cinema tonight. Your phone probably does know if you've had a busy work day, because it saw lots of meetings in your diary. Whereas if your diary was empty, it's probably had a pretty laid back day.
Pull up the itinerary for a travel.
Yep. It can be done with relative ease. Yeah, and of course the aspects of you as an individual, like for example your personality or your broader values, they don't change that much. They do change a little over time, but you're looking small changes over very extended periods of time. So even in that case, that's kind of information you'd only have to tap into the system once every few years. So it's definitely there in conceptual terms, and technologically I'm pretty confident it's possible too. But it's obviously that requires yet another set of investment from the music industry to actually go down that route. And obviously at the minute, given they've had a pretty rough time over the last 10 or 20 years or so, I think you could probably excuse them doing a little bit of profit taking at the moment.
But do you think it might be a matter of, well, let's see if we can, we have to wait and see if the company can even make it to not getting into a Chapter 11 bankruptcy before they can even get these new things.
Exactly, yeah, like I say, and obviously setting this up is expensive. Just simply, maintaining the licenses to have access to that music, that's a phenomenally expensive exercise. So this is the kind of thing that you could only do if you had a very, very large number of subscribers. It's not the kind of thing you could do with any ease if you're a relatively small startup, for example.
Are any of these services profitable?
I believe, I've got to finish this out. I think I read something the other day that talked about Spotify having gone over into profit. I'm not entirely certain, but certainly it's there or thereabouts. And as with all these, it's very much just a function of the subscriber base. And, it certainly works with scale.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, because if you're buying buying a massive all music license is essentially going to be a fixed cost.
To some extent, I'm not that familiar with the detail of it.
Okay. I guess we'll won't go there.
Yeah, I mean, I would, for what it's worth, I would presume if I was a record label, I would certainly insist on we will charge you a certain amount depending on the certain amount of subscribers who are listening. But I'm afraid I don't know. I'm sorry.
Okay.
And I suspect that might be a matter of commercial confidence anyway. It may well be that not that many people know.
Right. Well, best probably not to.
I'd
that area.
gloss over that one. Yeah.
So when are recommendations going to start getting good? Another disgracefully loaded question.
No. Oh, you know what? I rather than answer that directly, I'll tell you a very brief story. As a PhD student in 1996, Yeah, I remember at the time, myself and my supervisor, we edited a book, and in the foreword we wrote breathlessly that the technology even exists to download music to a portable laptop computer on a pay-per-play basis. 6 years later, the iPod came out, and ever since that day I've been, if only, if only we'd had the courage of our convictions. I think the bottom line is what I'm trying to say is, you can often see it's coming quite a few years ahead of the actuality. Because, of course, just because you can conceptually do something doesn't necessarily mean that it makes commercial sense to go through the expense of actually implementing all that. So,
well, Concorde was perfectly possible, but it didn't really make that much money, did it?
Yeah. So I think it's really kind of a two-part answer to your question. The technology is there to make the recommendations really, really good. And I think the understanding of what drives musical taste is there to make the recommendations really, really good. Whether or not the investment to bring that about is worth the incremental cost, that's I think probably between Tim Cook and his spreadsheet.
And whoever runs Spotify in there.
Exactly.
Can you tell me more about another one of your studies that you've done? I haven't got the abstracts here, I'm afraid. What's another study that you've done you'd like to tell us about?
Oh, gosh.
Particularly interesting one, or uninteresting one, your choice.
Okay, sure. I'll tell you about a few studies, if you like, because it's something we haven't really touched on here. So I mentioned earlier one other aspect, or one other area in which all this plays out is around the use of music in commercial environments. So at the moment, whenever people think about music, they tend to think about streaming services, smartphones, and so on. But the other side of this is the music that is played to us by businesses as we go about our daily lives. And I think what's really interesting about that is up until about 15 or 20 years ago, it was really, really neglected. So up until then, and this isn't necessarily all that harsh. There are a few businesses out there who are a bit more sophisticated than this, but it was typically the case whereby the business, the provider of the music would say to a business, okay, tell us about the typical age of your customers and, write one paragraph on any particular business concerns that you might have. And then, because this was the 1990s, they'd then send them a few CDs in the post, and that became the in-store music policy. That was it. Now, what we've subsequently found out since then is that we know that if you select the right kind of music for a particular business, then there's plenty of evidence on this from people not just like me, that there are others who find this too, where if you pick the right kind of music, you can typically have positive impact on sales of 10, 20, 30%. They are not uncommon figures. And in particular, you can impact a whole range of different variables. And I think it's interesting to come back to the streaming services again. Interestingly, they're now starting to get attuned to this as well. They have kind of a business-facing version of their streaming service to start trying to tap into some of these effects. So we know that music can influence the products that people purchase. So I've done stuff where we've played French and German music in a supermarket, leading to people buying far more French or German wine, respectively. We've done stuff showing that if the music has, if you like, an upmarket stereotype associated with it, like, say, classical music, people start spending more money. And they really do, about 10, 15, 20%. You can use music to influence the perception of the premises as being for a certain type of customer or not for a certain type of customer. You can use music to influence not just how long people will wait around for, but how long they think they've been waiting. And you can even use music to attract people to a particular part of a set of premises.
I can see that being used at airports, tricking people into thinking they're not waiting that long for their...
All kinds of things like this. I mean, and the most crucial one, I think, for a lot of retailers is one big problem they have is getting people to go upstairs or downstairs or to the back. People tend to only come to the front bit. So, and again, there's a piece of research we did specifically where we played music in a particular bit of a very large area. And if the people like the music, they're more likely to go to that little part of the area. If they dislike the music, though, they're less likely to go there than if you even play no music at all. So again, it speaks to this idea that it's not just playing any music versus no music. You've got to get the right kind of music. So there's all kinds of influences like this. I could go on. We know that fast music leads to people drinking more quickly. It leads to people eating more quickly. If you play slow music in a supermarket, people will shop more slowly, but they browse more and so spend more. There's an awful lot of this kind of research out there now that wasn't there about 15, 20 years ago. And again, particularly now that retailers themselves have got access to the streaming services and the big library of music, they can really start to take advantage of these kind of effects.
Well, I guess that brings us on to a little money-saving pro tip. If you want to save money when you're at DJs, listen to some Radio 1 or some Hit FM. And if you want to save money when you're at a restaurant, then listen to some classical music, I guess. And what's another study that you've done?
So another thing I've been really interested in recently is looking at kind of very large samples of music and very large samples of music lyrics and looking at the kind of patterns you can see in there. And that's really been quite good fun. And again, to be honest, this is one of these real fringe benefits of music being digitized. Of course, now that everything is there and digitized, that means you can put it into Excel pretty easily, which means you can start to analyze it pretty easily. So what we've been doing very recently, we published this just about 6 months ago, is testing some of the big theories in aesthetics, which themselves literally go back to the days of Plato and Aristotle, and actually seeing if they're borne out in music sales. So one thing we did where we well, it really does come direct from Plato or Aristotle. One of them, and I forget who, I've got no idea which one it was, said something like, a master of art avoids excess, in other words, too much of something, and deficit, too little of something, but seeks the intermediate and chooses this. Okay, in other words, moderation is everything. So what we did, we got two separate databases, one of 250,000 pieces of music that had basically enjoyed any sort of commercial success in the United States, be it played on the radio more than, I think, 5 times, something like that, and another 143,000 pieces of music that had the same status in the UK, and then looked at the relationship between the properties of the music and their commercial success. And actually, we didn't find that. Plato and Aristotle were wrong. What we found specifically is that it was basically, of those pieces, we found that it was the material that tended to be more popular was the music that was either a bit more exciting than average or a bit more calming than average. And the stuff that was more in between those two was slightly less popular. And again, that speaks to the idea of music being contextualized. Of course, if music that's a little bit exciting or a little bit calming is disproportionately popular, what that's telling you is that indeed that's people using music to achieve a particular state of mind. But it's not people seeking the intermediate and choosing this. And of course, you can do just the same thing with lyrics, because of course, you can access lyrics in text file format relatively easily, which in turn means that you can put them through text analysis programs. And something we did there was looking at how pop music lyrics reflect the economy. So from memory, what we found there was, in this case, we got about 5,000 pieces of music, all of which had been in the top 5 singles in the UK sales charts. And then we looked at how that related to turbulence on the London Stock Exchange. Basically, we just looked at the standard deviation in the closing price. So basically, the more turbulent the stock market is, the more economic turmoil there is, the more stable it is, the greater economic stability there is. And what we found is that, from memory, is that basically the lyrics became more comforting and calming in times of economic turmoil. In other words, it's people looking to music to provide some sort of emotional succor in times of economic and often social turbulence. So again, it fits with this idea of people actually using music to achieve a particular goal. At this, in this case, at the level of economies and populations. So it's just the same process though as you or I choosing to listen to music to calm down on the way home from work. A population of music listeners is actually just however many million people individually listen to music. But it's interesting that these effects aggregate up. There's another great bit of research, one of my favourite bits of research ever done, that was just done way back in the 1990s by a guy called, I think it's Hal Zullo. And what he found is that you could use pessimism in pop music lyrics to predict changes in American gross national product. And so basically, as I recall, he found that as lyrics became more pessimistic, so 6 months down the line, economic optimism dipped. And as any economist can tell you, economic optimism dipping is one of the big drivers of a recession coming. So in other words, you can use changes in pop music lyrics to predict a recession.
So it shows up a mirror to ourselves.
Absolutely. And it's this idea that, again, music is part of daily life. The music you listen to on the radio or on your phone or whatever it is you're driving around, those messages hit home. And either you're using music to reflect the environment you're in and try to deal with that, or arguably in some cases, even you've got the music creating this national level mood and creating, a nation in a particular mindset. And I think that's absolutely fascinating. Everyone knows, or at least everyone feels, that music must be having some sort of influence on them. But to actually see it coming out in terms of these macroeconomic drivers of, really significant stuff like stock market turbulence, gross national product, recession, and so on, that's really quite interesting, I think.
The first 30 seconds of a song are very important, particularly for new artists, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the big challenges with music streaming is, of course, if you're a big brand, and I use the word deliberately, say Paul McCartney, Beyonce, whatever, people are going to come to you. Whereas if you're a new band or a new musician who people don't know about, first of all, they've got to find you, but crucially, you're only going to receive your royalty after people have listened to your track for a certain period of time. From memory, I think it is about 30 seconds. So what that's, and there's plenty of anecdotal evidence out there. The industry, of course, and new musicians have certainly cottoned onto this. It's starting to change music a little bit, because what it means is it's absolutely imperative that you keep people listening for the first 30 seconds, the first 1 minute of your track. If I had any sort of musical ability whatsoever and I was putting out music, every single good idea, I would get into those first 30 seconds to a minute, because after that, frankly, you've been paid and you're in the game. But that is clearly starting to drive the way in which people, develop their music. I was reading a piece not that long ago, and I think it was The Guardian, kind of bemoaning the death of the introduction in music, in pop music in particular. And this is, of course, the argument why. They were saying that, you've got to hit people right between the eyes from the get-go. It's interesting as well, I've always thought about it, is the Beatles are absolutely brilliant at this. A little game you can play with yourself is put on any Beatles track, and inside the first 45 seconds, you've basically heard the entire song. Now, contrast that with, you'll have had, the chorus, the bridge, the verse, the chorus, and the bridge. And contrast that with, an awful lot of other artists. They don't seem to get on with it quite so fast. And I've always wondered if that's part of the reason why the Beatles were so successful, is because they absolutely, nailed it in that first 30 to 45 seconds.
How has music streaming, the instant availability of music, affected the sort of genres and subgenres of music that we're listening to?
Yeah. I think to some extent you can make the case that by having music, omnipresent and all of it available to you, you could argue it might even form the death of genres. I mean, certainly, maybe I'm getting old, but you have certainly, it seems to me like that there's an increasing speed or increasing acceleration of the fracturing of genres into increasingly niche subgenres, which of course makes sense because you can market them in that way and people can search for them using the right keyword. If you know the name of that subgenre, you can search a streaming service and get all the music in that subgenre, so you can do it. And eventually, if you carry on down that line, you end up with no such thing as a genre. You just have an individual musician or an individual composer. And so
an individual song.
An individual song, yeah. Maybe it goes down to that level eventually. So I think it's, to some extent, it's a case of, while ever it's commercially useful to have genres labelled as such, they will clearly persist in that way. But it's very much now, it's not so much a genre. I think you would argue it's a keyword. It's a search term. And I think that in the context of a streaming service, I think that's arguably a better way of understanding what we mean by genres. It's not a collection of musicians. It's not a collection of albums. It's not a subculture. It's a keyword search term. And one last question, Adrian. What are you up to right now? Well, not right now. What research are you up to right now? Not literally right now, but certainly as of yesterday evening, what I was doing was I've been getting increasingly interested in the relationship between cultural values and music. I mentioned earlier that most of the research on, if you look at social influences on behaviour, it works at 4 different levels. Factors inside you, factors between individuals, between groups, and at the broad cultural level. The great majority of research that's been done has been very much at the lower down levels, at factors internal to ourselves, like personality has been done an awful lot, and factors relating to people, relating to one another as individuals. What's scarcely been done at all, quantitatively at least, is looking at music at the very broad cultural level. So say factors like, economic recession and so on. So literally what I'm working on at the moment is something which looks at personality, but also personal values defined slightly more broadly than that, but also cultural values. So for example, to what extent do people value individualism versus collectivism? I'm looking at how all those relate to musical taste and the uses to which we put music. And I think what's interesting is that although it seems blindingly obvious that music as a cultural product ought to link to cultural values, as far as I'm aware, this data set is the first one that actually provides some quantitative evidence that that's the case. I mean, maybe I've missed something in my literature review, but I'm pretty sure we haven't. And yeah, it's the first evidence out there, I think, that quantifies the link between culture and the ways in which people use music. And that's, that could run for 10 years, that line of research, I think. Okay, cool. Well, thank you very much, Adrian, for coming in and for sharing your knowledge on this topic. Thank you. I hope that's useful. And you've been listening to The Future Of, a podcast powered by Curtin University. If you have any questions about today's topic, please feel free to get in touch by following the links in the show notes. Bye for now.